everyone. Thank you for being here at BSidesSF today. Just to let you know, the Slido is not working today, but we will have live question and answers at the end. And then we can also, if there's any follow-up questions, we can take care of that in the lobby. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Last time I spoke at B-Sides was in February of 2020. Anybody remember that conference? There was like a sponsor here that was giving out little like keychains of hand sanitizer. And when we were like packing up at the end, there were like hundreds left over. And a month later, I was like, why didn't I take more of those? But, you know, we didn't know, right? We didn't know. And I think that's one of the things we've seen in the last couple of years. Like a lot of things have changed. But one of the things that we've seen change is there's a lot more people doing business online now. And that means, of course, that there's more money that we as like security people working in web application security, mobile security, there's more considerations that we have to deal with because there's more fraud and there's more money that's getting lost to account takeover. But we're also finally starting to see some of these stronger authentication methods, things like WebAuthn, things like passkeys even, that are finally being used for a consumer audience. But we're also all human, right? Like, we need to consider account recovery in this process when we're doing the authentication system design that we're building, because we need to balance that humanness, that user experience with preventing fraud. And I specifically called out consumer account recovery in this talk because one, that's what I focus on in my day-to-day work, but I think there's a little bit of a different way that we have to think about that when we're dealing with end user consumers that are not our employees, that we're not paying to consider this problem. When we're thinking about enterprise account recovery, you might have like an IT help desk that you can call up and deal with the answer that way. You know, we're thinking about this in a way that there's a lot of overlap between account recovery among the spaces, but you don't have that kind of like enterprise fallback. So I'm going to be focusing on the consumer side of this today. So again, thank you for having me here. My name is Kelley Robinson. I've been a developer for over a decade now, and I've been working in security at Twilio for the last 6 years. I've been helping out with BSidesSF for a few years too. So again, thank you to the team for everybody that's volunteered and for having me back. I focus on Twilio's account security products for things like phone verification, user identity, and two-factor authentication. This talk is going to incorporate a lot of the things that I've learned during my time there from working with our developers and working with our customers on their authentication challenges. And then it's also going to incorporate some of the things that we've learned. We own Authy. We bought Authy 8 years ago now. Some people still don't realize that Authy is owned by Twilio, but we have this consumer-facing product for MFA, but that also has an account recovery process to it too, right? Like, so that's something we have to consider when we're building that product. So in terms of what I'm going to talk about today, after I get some context on what account recovery is and how I'm thinking about it, walk through the options that we have, including some real life examples, some companies that I think are doing some stuff well, and then I'll wrap up with some recommendations on how you can use this in your own systems. So of course we hope that users don't lock themselves out of their accounts, right? Like that's the hope, but of course it's going to happen. And there's a lot of common reasons that are not even like user error for this. Things that we have to think about: people change their phone numbers, they forget their passwords, they lose their device, their authenticator or their security key, they upgrade to the latest iPhone, and they forget that there was anything important on their old device. They forget that they needed to transfer all of those Google Authenticator tokens, and now all of a sudden those are lost. And so it's up to us to address these issues while still guarding against the attackers and the account takeover attempts. If anyone was in the last session, you know, Pinterest was talking about how they handle account takeovers and some of the protections they use against passwords. This is going to extend on that and talk about how you might think about that with more than just a password, with some of these other authentication methods that we use and that we see consumer authentication being used for. So again, like account recovery is risky because you're not just authenticating, you're reproving the identity. And it's not an identity that comes with a clean slate anymore. It's not the sign up that you might not have to do that email verification if your growth team tells you that they want to skip it. The existing account likely already has data or money attached to it. And so that's one of the things that you have to consider when you're reproving this identity. And the emphasis here is mine, but I really like how Mark Lovelace characterized account recovery here as this alternative authentication system. He says, in essence, it's a bypass of the main account security protocols and therefore should be treated as this alternative authentication system. And there are all these risks associated with account recovery. I think, we I tried to like pull the latest numbers for like the cost of ATO fraud. And like, I don't know, like all these companies, these research companies have different figures that they'll give you, but it's like always in the billions, right? That they'll exaggerate, but it's a lot of money. And like your company probably, hopefully has some kind of quantification of the cost of this to your business, whether that's the support costs that you're dealing with in order to address these account recovery attempts, or the amount of money that's lost to fraud from the account takeover actually happening. And so the best estimates that I could come up with from the research that I found is that this, if you end up with that kind of last resort of the user has to contact support, support calls can cost anywhere from $40 to $70 per call. And so that's a lot of money that you have to be thinking about if your user ends up at that process. And this is why it's often worth it to invest in your account recovery process to save your support teams the headaches and to save your company more money. So you have a lot of options for account recovery, and that goes beyond just sending an email reset for your password. And so this is where we start to see things like security questions, which are not recommended, things like backup codes, fallback channels, whatever that might be for your business. And the requirements for account recovery, I wanted to highlight a couple of things here because they might be slightly different from your everyday classic authentication. And primarily that since it's not happening very often, one, it can be slower, but two, you need methods that can be accessed without constant rehearsal, as I saw like one researcher put it. So you think about something like a password or even a security key. If you're using that daily, like you're less likely to lose that security key because you need it every day to log into your computer, or you are constantly typing in your password. I know a lot of people in this room probably use a password manager, but a lot of consumers and users of the end user applications that we build probably aren't. And so they're typing and they're remembering these passwords, and that constant rehearsal helps them. 7, 8, 9 months later, when they lose that password, lose the key, forget something, they're not going to have that same level of rehearsal for whatever backup method. And so this is why security questions became a thing, because you're not like going to forget your first pet or the color of your first car. But this also needs to be usable, since this is, and again, I'm not suggesting that you use security questions. I'm just like saying that's why they became popular, right? But this is something that also needs to be usable, right? Because this is something that most people will do. Some Google research from a little bit ago reported a nearly linear relation between time passed and the number of users who use the fallback authentication system. After 18 months, 70% of Google's users had done some kind of basic account recovery. I'm sure your business has seen similar things where this is something that you definitely have to deal with. You're going to want to build this into your considerations. And one thing I wanted to look at was how the different methods, how effective the different methods can be, right? And how effective they are for account recovery. So the more of these that you collect when the user first signs up, the more that you'll have to trust and verify against when they attempt an account recovery. And this is one of those things where you're like probably gonna, if anybody does like the account security at your company, you've probably had those conversations with your growth team, right? They're like, no, we need to make this frictionless so that we can get users signed up as fast as possible so that I can hit my metrics of like the number of users that signed up. And you're pushing back on that saying, no, we need to have some level of assurance about who these users are. And this is going to be that back and forth poll that like I see some people nodding about this, right? So this is something that you want to think about, have those conversations. When you collect these up front, you're going to have an easier time down the line. Even if you're not having that user, use one of those methods that they enroll with every time that they sign in. And this is why we do email verification, right? You're not necessarily having the user send an email to themselves every time they log in, but this is something that comes in handy down the line. All right, let's start with some things that these knowledge methods. These could be passwords, security questions, or specific account information like recent transactions or hopefully other secret details about the account. I've had people ask me like how much a recent expense was on my account that I might have bought with an e-commerce site. I've had companies ask when I last called customer support. These are examples of knowledge things that you might encounter that aren't going to be that kind of security question method that we all love. So knowledge factors are great because they're easy to use and set up and they can't be lost. The reason that, again, that security questions became so popular is because you're not going to forget them. But passwords can be breached. Many security questions or account details can be searched. And it's also not impossible to just find or guess the street that someone grew up on or the color of their first car, right? And of course, humans are forgetful. So anything like a password can be lost in that way. Possession factors, these are the things that you have. These tend to be more secure than passwords because they can be harder to phish and they don't get leaked in data breaches. These could also include things like your phone, backup or recovery codes, and hardware security keys or security tokens or YubiKeys. When it comes to something that you have, people tend to lose and replace things, right? Like I talked about people upgrading to the new iPhone or losing their phone, right? And this means that it's harder to guarantee for account recovery. Possession can also introduce that additional friction, right? And this is one of the things that we always have to think about. Even getting someone to download an app can be a lot harder than telling them to enter a security question or something like that. And this is one of the things that I think we're starting to try to change with solutions like passkeys. They're trying to solve that usability problem by integrating the authentication into the devices that we already have and the systems that we already use. And the third category that I wanted to talk about is not inherence, like if you're following the kind of classic 3 factors of authentication, but it's actually the social proof side of things. And this relies on authorizing trusted contacts and doesn't really fall into that kind of classic authentication factor categorization. And so companies like Facebook, obviously a very social company from the get-go, they allow you to nominate 3 to 5 friends that can help confirm your identity before they give your account back to you. And the nice thing about Facebook is they let you do this after you get locked out of your account. So this is not necessarily something that you have to set up before. One of the things that they ran into is then hackers were trying to then friend people on the account or like take over an account by like adding new untrusted friends and then doing the account takeover. And so Facebook has fixed that problem by making sure that the friends that you're nominating to get your account recovered are people that you've had a longer term relationship with and that they identify as more trusted contacts. And so this is one of the things, right? They're allowing you to do this after the fact. And so you're going to be motivated to do this setup. If you are a social company that needs to get users to set this up beforehand, that might be the challenge here, right? The kind of usability aspect of getting people to enroll in this recovery factor. But I think this is really smart if your company has any kind of social or dynamic connections between users. This is definitely something that you can use even in a more like enterprise setting, right? This is a really, smart way that if you have multiple business users that are tied to the same account, you can have them vouch for each other in terms of getting the account access back without having to contact like an account rep or someone like that. A couple of like specific channels that I wanted to highlight. One type of possession factor that we see a lot for account recovery is these backup tokens or recovery codes. And these codes are given to you, so they're more likely to be longer and less likely to be reused, right? However, that means that people have to store these somewhere. And while some sites will give you explicit options, I've seen things from like, write them down, save them in your password manager, email them to yourself. Like these are all recommendations that I've seen in the real world. This is a screenshot from Instagram that is a real example with fake codes that does not give any useful guidance of what to do with these, right? So I've always wondered, like, how effective are these actually? Like, do people actually save them? I met one person that, like, literally prints them out and, like, puts them in their home safe, and that's great for them. I'm not going to do that probably, and most users probably aren't either. So, like, how many users are actually doing this? So I was pleasantly surprised when I was talking to one of our customers, and they're doing many thousands of authentications every week, and they're actually seeing hundreds of users using their backup codes every week. And so 1% of their users are doing this on a weekly basis, and that might not seem like a lot, like 1% doesn't seem like a big number, but that does factor out to hundreds of users, and if that's allowing those users to get back into their accounts without going through customer support, that's good for both you and your business. And so this is one of the things that, like, I was pleasantly surprised to see that backup codes, which can be relatively easy to implement, is a reasonable solution for the account recovery problem. And the last specific method that I wanted to call out is passkeys, right? Like, is anybody actually using passkeys yet? I see like a couple people like enthusiastically raising their hands. I've encountered this like on a couple of companies. I know like Cloudflare has implemented this. Good for them. I'm proud of everybody that's like trying to push this forward. So passkeys, new evolution of WebAuthn. And I know there's critiques on passkeys. Like I've heard people say like, is it actually 2FA? But I think one of the things that passkeys are trying to explicitly attempt to solve is this account recovery problem. And that's because you're syncing the private keys in the cloud. And like, that's a little scary maybe. maybe. But what this allows is that strong form of authentication can be used by default across devices without having the user needing to authenticate or set up every new device, right? So like I am able to sign in on this laptop with a Touch ID because that's stored on this individual laptop. Like if I want to, use that same method on a different device, I have to register on a different device, but Passkeys attempts to solve that problem. And Apple calls this out in their docs. They say passkey synchronization provides convenience and redundancy in case of a loss of a single device. So this is great, right? But then you read a little bit more into this, and Apple's not the only one that's implemented this. This is like an industry-wide collective, but their alternative account recovery, if you lose all of your devices, means that you use your iCloud account password and SMS authentication. So, they're still thinking about the backup to the backup to the backup, right? And that's one of the things that we all have to think about too as well. So let's take a look at a couple of companies that I think are doing this well. Some companies are intentionally vague about this, but I've highlighted a couple that have pretty good documentation about their process and what they do for account recovery. The first one I already called out is Cloudflare. I always look to them to see what they're doing on the forefront of authentication because I think, they serve a technical audience. And so you can probably get away with a little bit more of a tech forward approach and a little bit more of the bleeding edge approach to some authentication solutions. And so, they were one of the first companies that I saw to implement WebAuthn. They're now using passkeys for that. And they offer a lot of options for account recovery, but if you run out of options, this is kind of the last resort. So in addition to email verification, they require an active session on your account. And if you don't have an active session somewhere, a browser that's been previously logged in, then you're kind of screwed. It's pretty common to, require this active session, but it's not always explicitly called out. You can think of this kind of like a possession factor, right? It's a previously verified device or a browser. And to be safe, then, they also implement a 3 to 5 day waiting period. And I'll talk a little bit more about waiting periods in a minute, but it makes sense, right? An attacker might not want to wait, but a real user probably would. And that's one of those ways that you can start to balance that ATO prevention. GitHub is another company that I think, is doing pretty great when it comes to account recovery and user authentication in general. Also, calling this out as probably serves a more technical audience, right? They have different considerations than someone like Pinterest might. And GitHub has extensive documentation about their 2FA recovery process. They also offer a lot of options for what you can do in terms of setting up authentication factors or fallback factors. One option is recovery tokens that they require you to set up when you register certain types of devices for authentication. And they will also allow you to fall back to SMS if you have a stronger form of 2FA enabled like TOTP or YubiKeys. I've had this debate with people of is it worth it to allow, these stronger forms of authentication like TOTP, YubiKeys, if you're going to allow fallback to SMS? And that depends on how you approach it, right? This is something that's still probably going to be stronger than maybe a customer support, probably cheaper than having the user call customer support. And it might be enough of a hassle to deter some amount of hackers. GitHub does an interesting thing where you can configure your Facebook account to store a recovery token to get back into GitHub. That has the downside of requiring that you have a Facebook account. But the upside is that you're likely to be able to access Facebook even if you lose access to GitHub. Those might be two different things that you have two different sets of credentials for. And then anecdotally, I have a friend that went through the account recovery process with GitHub. And in line with the warning that is showed here, GitHub told them that they needed to unlink their email address so that they could use it again to create a new account. They could fork all of their repos over to the new account. And then if in 6 months their old account that was locked out is still dormant, they could re-access that account. Their username would be released to them. And so that's pretty extreme and unforgiving, 6 months. I mean, at least it allows them to get access to it eventually. I don't know if this is still true or true for all accounts. Maybe my friend's account was especially high risk, but that's definitely something that you want to think about. Make sure you have those recovery keys safe for your GitHub account, and something that you can consider in terms of the extremities of waiting periods that you might consider. All right, and then diving into some of the recommendations. So these are just some examples of what different companies are currently doing. now what you can do for your own company. And I think it's important to preface all of this by saying that there's no one right answer here. So this is taken from the OWASP multi-factor authentication cheat sheet. They say there is no definitive best way to do this, and what is appropriate will vary hugely based on the security of the application and the level of control that you have over your users. This again gets back to that kind of enterprise versus consumer authentication approach that you might take. Think about what makes sense for your company, for your users. You definitely don't need to do everything I recommend here. This is kind of like a menu of options that you might think about as you're designing these processes or revamping them. All right, the biggest thing you can do, have users register more factors, more methods than they need than for everyday login. Somebody kind of eloquently put this like 3FA for 2FA. I know it's not really 3 factors, but you want to at least have 2 methods that someone can use to get back into their account if they have MFA enabled. And the biggest benefit of that is that you have the additional trusted factors and that you can use those to compare against when your user loses access to one of their main factors. And the more that you have registered, the more confident that you can be that it's the right person that you're letting in and not an account takeover. Register these at sign up during an active session. That's really up to you. But requiring users to register these additional factors, it might create some additional overhead in that process, especially during sign up, but it's justifiable for certain use cases. Like fintech, some of these like higher assurance industries where KYC has more regulations and controls around it. That's something that you're probably going to be okay with. If somebody's opening a new bank account, like they might expect that might take a couple of minutes to do. Similarly, do some threat modeling, right? Like look at your ATO costs. It's going to be different for everyone. Maybe this is something that isn't actually costing you that much money if someone contacts support, and that's fine. Like you might not need to do extensive revamping of your process here if it's not costing you a lot of money, but understand how much you're losing. You want to make sure that you're making the right level of investment for your company in the account recovery process. You're in that higher value industry like financial services. That can mean adding more friction to that recovery process. But consider it from your customer's perspective too, right? Like, did they understand the value? If you're like Gemini or Coinbase and the user is trying to go through this process, they're probably willing to put in a little bit of extra effort to regain access to their account. They're going to be okay with that waiting period. That's probably going to be more true than like if they're signing up for like a Paramount Plus account. Along the lines of looking at your threat model, you also want to be intentional about where and how you're allowing your staff to facilitate account recovery. So this was a conversation that I had in Twitter DMs before Twitter imploded, where I was able to get a customer support representative to reset my account just by giving them my phone number and email. And my Twitter account is my full name, but it's not connected to my profile of this company. And I'm not saying that this company shouldn't let their customer support do this, because it was like a really easy experience and that was nice, but like it's sensitive enough that I don't want to tell you who it was. And so I'm more paranoid about this than the average person because I like think about this for my everyday work, but this is something that you want to think about. It's all about evaluating those trade-offs. Another thing you can do is prompt users to confirm account information that could be used for recovery when they log in. This is something that's useful if you have consumers that are coming back to your application on a regular basis. Obviously, this is not going to be true for everyone. One of our customers, does tax preparation software. That's like a really hard thing to do with account recovery, right? Because you have users that are using it about once a year, and they probably forget their password in between years. That can be something that can be challenging. But one way that GitHub does the prompt for account recovery is shown on this slide. And so there's the same idea behind things like security checkups, email notifications to review your account. That might be, sending an email notification to folks before tax season. If you're that kind of tax preparation software, that might be a strategy that you could use. And these types of reminders are relatively cheap and easy to implement, especially compared to the cost of a customer lockout or a support call. Be proactive about these types of reminders. Send the email reminders before the holidays, before new iPhone releases. We always see Authy customer support tickets go up around these times because that's when people tend to switch phones and get locked out. That's one way that you can do is those proactive email reminders. And then hopefully you're already doing this, but design your 2FA onboarding really well. This is from a 2018 study. 83% of Google users were able to successfully set up YubiKeys compared to 32% of Facebook users. And a lot has changed since 2018 in terms of like YubiKeys and how they're designed and the way that they work. But I think it's a good look at how onboarding UX impacts users' success, right? You want to make sure that they're doing an actual verification before you enable that on their account. 19% of people locked themselves out of Windows entirely because they didn't require that users set it up correctly before they enabled it as a like check mark on the account. And finally, we recommend adding a waiting period to deter hackers and give real users time to dispute account takeover attempts. It's never going to be perfect, but it will be effective for the right types of customers. Slow down the attacker, respond to legitimate users. A couple of things that I want to say you shouldn't do. Don't only use one factor for account recovery. If you have two-factor enabled, that kind of defeats the purpose of account recovery. And please, please don't be this company. This is like the situation that inspired this entire talk, which was if you're going to disable two-factor authentication on account recovery, like don't even bother offering 2FA, right? Like in this situation, I'd forgotten my password or it gotten like messed up in my password manager, but I still had access to the second factor. So like don't disable it if you're that company. And finally, don't let this discourage you. Don't give up on 2FA. Google research shows that even SMS codes sent to a recovery phone number help prevent 76% of targeted attacks. That's really good coverage and can protect a lot of people from account takeover. I wrote a blog post about this if you want to read more. That's on the Twilio blog. I hope I've given you some ideas for how to think about your account recovery processes. If you have any questions, we're out of time, but I'll be out in the hallway. You can find me after the talk. Once again, my name is Kelley Robinson, and thank you for listening.